Part 1. The bargain in the dust. The harsh West had a simple, brutal law. Everything had a price. But what happens when a man of quiet honor finds a price tag on something that can't be bought? Something the world has long since given up on. This is a story about the kind of strength that doesn't make a sound, the kind of bond that doesn't need words, and the one choice that can change a life. In the late summer of 1881, the heat still clung to the dusty Texas air, baking the small market town. The lowing of cattle and the shouting of men haggling over prices filled the air, thick with the smell of whiskey and worn leather. The last auction of the season was winding down, yet a small crowd still lingered near a dusty corral. Inside, a scrawny bay mare stood trembling, her ribs stark beneath a hide striped with old blood. Jonah Blackwood, a man of 40 shaped by the unforgiving land, squinted against the sun. Had come to town for supplies and maybe a horse. Had noticed the mare earlier, and as the bidding dropped off, his boot heels kicked up a small cloud of dust as he made his way to the gate. That's when his attention was caught by her. A girl, no more than 20, stood just behind the corral fence. Her face was hidden by matted hair, and her dress was torn. Her bare feet were caked in a thick layer of dust. She didn't speak or cry, her eyes wandering, unfocused, as if she was watching something only she could see. Next to her stood a man, a flask clutched in one hand and a rope in the other. The rope was tied not to the horse, but to the girl's wrist. "Got a quiet one here," the drunk slurred, his voice cutting through the noise. "Don't talk, don't hear, neither. But she cleans and cooks, and she don't sass back. She's a bargain." A few men in the crowd laughed, a dry, humorless sound. One of them spat into the dirt. Jonah's first instinct was to turn away. He wasn't here for this. He needed a horse, not a burden. But then he felt it, a shift in the air, a silent plea that wasn't a sound. The girl was watching him, her gaze clear and steady. There was no terror in her eyes, no begging, just a deep, settled awareness, a reflection of a loneliness he knew well. The drunk stumbled forward. "Got some coin? The horse comes with her. I ain't dragging her back. She ain't worth the dust on her toes." Jonah hesitated, his eyes moving from the trembling horse to the silent girl. He looked the drunk directly in the eye and said, "I'll take both." A wave of rough laughter broke out. "Buying livestock or starting a family, old man?" someone jeered, but Jonah ignored them. He counted out coins, more than the drunk deserved, more than enough for a horse, but not a soul. The drunk yanked the rope, but the girl flinched, instinctively stepping behind Jonah. "She's yours now," the drunk slurred, tossing the rope aside. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Ain't worth the trouble." Jonah untied the rope, letting it fall, and led the horse out of the pen. The girl followed, her steps light and deliberate, a thin shawl clutched around her shoulders. She waited silently as he opened the back of his wagon, and she folded herself into a corner, like someone who had mastered the art of being unseen. As he climbed onto the driver's bench, he felt the slightest brush against his coat. Her small, calloused fingers had touched his sleeve once. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the distant hills, but in that single touch, he felt her trust. The wagon groaned, its wheels crunching over the packed dirt road, leaving the town behind. Behind him, the girl sat curled under a blanket, her face turned to the wind. She never looked back, neither did he. Part 2. A home built on silence. Jonah's homestead was small, just a slanted roof house, a few sheds, and a long stretch of prairie. It was quiet, clean, and enough for a man like him. He helped the girl down from the wagon. She stepped lightly, her eyes sweeping over the land with a quiet watchfulness. Inside the kitchen, Jonah stoked the fire and pointed to the kettle. She nodded, moving to the hearth with a practiced ease, finding the tin cups and ladle like she'd been born for a life of fire and hunger. She still hadn't made a sound. After a quiet meal, Jonah handed her a piece of chalk. He tapped the wooden door frame beside the table. "Your name," he said slowly. She looked at him, then crouched and wrote a single word in soft, slanted letters. "Elara." He read the name aloud, testing the sound on his tongue. She gave no smile, only turned and walked toward the barn. The next morning, Jonah found her in the stable, crouched beside the mare. The horse had barely eaten, its back leg swollen from a past injury. Elara was running a damp cloth down its flank, her hands communicating a gentle rhythm, a quiet form of understanding. Jonah watched, arms crossed. He had seen men kicked for less, but the mare stood perfectly still, allowing the girl to wrap its leg with patient hands. She couldn't hear, but she understood. Each night, she wrote him notes in chalk. Bacon low, dog limping, wine smells like dust. They never spoke, but the silence between them was no longer empty. Then the storm came. It started like most Texas storms, a slow trick of the light. A hot breeze rose at sundown, and Jonah saw the clouds gathering but thought nothing of it. He was in the cattle shed when Elara appeared, barefoot, her hair wild, her breathing quick but silent. She grabbed his sleeve and tugged hard. "What?" he asked. She pointed to the sky, her hands trembling, eyes wide with warning. A crack ripped the air. Lightning struck the tree behind the shed, and the blast shook the ground. Flames leapt as the tree collapsed in a shower of sparks. Jonah stumbled back, stunned. How had she known? She had moved before the thunder, before the air had changed. She had known. That night, after the fire was out, Jonah sat with her at the kitchen table. No chalk, no words, just a man and a girl the world called deaf. And yet she had heard. From that day on, Jonah watched her differently, not with suspicion, but with a growing curiosity. Elara never spoke or signed, and she rarely wrote more than a few words. Yet she always seemed to know things before they happened. One morning, a cow stood alone in the pasture, head low and refusing to eat. Jonah dismissed it as nothing more than the cold, but Elara moved without hesitation. She laid straw in the birthing stall, drew fresh water, and stayed beside the animal, stroking its belly. By nightfall, the cow was in labor. She had known. Jonah said nothing, but that night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering who she really was. Part 3. The town's fear days turned to weeks. Life on the ranch found a rhythm. Elara boiled water, mended torn shirts, and brushed the horses. She was always listening, but not with her ears. Sometimes, Jonah would find her standing barefoot in the grass, eyes closed, palms open to the wind, as if the land itself whispered to her. The town noticed. It began with whispers. At the blacksmith, someone muttered, "She stares too long at the cattle, like she knows which one's going to die." At the general store, a woman pulled her child closer as Elara passed, clutching a basket of flour. Jonah tried to ignore it, but the unease grew. When a ranch hand's goat gave birth early, tongues wagged that Elara had touched it the day before. When a boy fell sick with fever, and Elara brewed him an herbal tea that helped him recover, his mother later whispered. How did she know what to give him without being told? Fear fed on her silence, making her an easy target. 3 nights later, they came. 8 townsfolk stood at the gate, their boots grinding into the dirt. Their leader, a grim-faced Mr. Finch, stepped forward, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "We want her gone," he said flatly. "That girl hears things she ought not to." Jonah stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, jaw hard. "She's mute," he replied. "That ain't the same as deaf," Finch shot back. "She sees storms before they break. She handles beasts that buck every man. That ain't natural." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. One man spat on the ground. Inside the house, Elara stood behind the curtain, watching. She had seen mobs before, faces twisted by fear pretending to be certainty. She moved to open the door, but Jonah raised his hand, stopping her. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the thawing mud, and faced the crowd squarely. "She saved a child's life," he said, "or gave him the fever in the first place." A woman sneered. Jonah's voice dropped low, steady. "I've lived 40 years, and I can count on one hand the people who ever truly heard me. Not my words, but my silences, my grief." "She has." The crowd stilled. "You want to call that a curse? Then you've forgotten what a blessing looks like." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Finch opened his mouth, but closed it again. One by one, they turned and walked away, their boots heavy. The torches never lit, heart full. The girl who heard without ears that night. The ranch was quiet. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, staring into the fire. Elara poured warm cider into two tin cups, setting one before him, then sat across from him. She did not write or sign. Instead, after a long moment, she reached out and rested her hand on his. It was not gratitude, it was recognition. The silence in that cabin was no longer emptiness. It was a bond, steady and unspoken, between two souls who had learned to hear each other in a way the rest of the world never would. Winter crept hard across the plains, bringing snow that gathered against the fences and a wind that howled like wolves. Jonah worked the ranch slower now, his shoulders stiff, but he was no longer alone. Elara walked beside him, quiet but steady. He taught her to ride, her small hands gripping the saddle horn, her balance guided more by trust than skill. She taught him signs, simple movements that gave shape to words they had never shared aloud. Water, fire, thank you. He fumbled less and smiled more when she gently corrected him. Their nights were softer now. They would sit by the hearth, her needle stitching a cloak, his voice low as he played an old harmonica tune. She never said if she could hear it. She just closed her eyes and swayed, as if the sound reached her in some other way. But the town hadn't forgotten. Her name was still spoken in whispers at the well, and they still eyed her warily at church. Yet something was changing. When a neighbor, Tom Weaver, tore his shoulder and the doctor was gone, he came to Jonah's ranch. Elara bound the wound with steady hands. 2 days later, Tom tipped his hat to her in town. A widow, who hadn't slept in weeks, sat with Elara one night and by dawn was weeping with relief, clutching her hand. Slowly, the fear began to break. Then came the Sunday that sealed it. A 7-year-old boy vanished during chores. Only one boot was found near the tree line. Panic ripped through the town. Mothers cried, men shouted, and dogs barked uselessly. Jonah reached for his coat, ready to join the search, but Elara stopped him. She knelt in the dirt, pressing her palms flat to the frozen ground, her eyes closed. She rose, walked a few steps, then knelt again, tracing a trail no one else could see. A bent twig, a shifted pebble, a faint print from a small foot. The townsfolk stared as she moved, silent and steady, pointing west. They followed her. Jonah first, then Tom, then more. Through thickets, up ridges, down a dry creek bed, until in a clearing, they found him. The boy lay curled beneath a cedar tree, his ankle swollen, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Alive, his mother ran to him, sobbing. Elara simply knelt, brushing the boy's hair from his face. Relief softened her features, not pride or triumph. When they carried the boy home, no one called her cursed anymore. They called her what she truly was, the girl who listened with her heart. Part 5. The promise in the twilight years slipped by. The ranch weathered storms and drought, but it also grew gentler. Children often came, learning from Elara how to listen to the wind, the animals, and the silence. She never lectured. She showed them with her hands, her patience, and her rare smile that felt like the sunrise. Jonah built a bench under the cottonwood tree. They sat there most evenings, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun sink into the wide horizon. He would pour tea. She would take his hand, and in the quiet space between them, they both felt complete. One twilight, after many years, Elara turned to him. She had learned a few words, rough but careful. Her lips shaped them slowly. I do not need sound, she whispered. Only you. Jonah blinked hard, his throat tight. I hear you, he said. Always have. The wind carried their silence like a hymn across the prairie. From that day forward, no one questioned her again. When children asked about the quiet woman at the ranch, the answer was simple. She was the one who heard without ears, spoke without words, and loved without fear.